My mother, Eleanor Voss, 76 years old, former school librarian, woman who organized 42 years of other people's stories into systems so precise that she could locate any book in that building blindfolded, has picked up the phone on the second ring for as long as I have owned a phone. Not the first ring, because she does not like to seem eager. Not the third, because she does not like to make people wait. The second ring. Every time. For 17 years. So when the woman at Sycamore Hills Care and Rehabilitation told me, for the fourth time in 6 days, that my mother was sleeping and could not come to the phone, I sat in my car in the parking garage at work and I stared at the concrete wall in front of me and I thought about 17 years of second rings and I knew something was wrong. I just did not know yet how wrong. My name is Cassandra Webb and I am 44 years old and I am a high school English teacher in Portland, Oregon, and my mother lives, or lived, depending on where in the story you are, in a care facility in Boise, Idaho, 240 miles and 1 mountain range from my front door. I want to tell you everything. I'm going to tell you everything. But before I do, I need you to stay with me for the full length of this, because the part that matters most is not the part you are expecting, and I need you to be here when we get to it. Subscribe right now if you have not already. This channel continues because you are in it, and this story is the reason I started it, and I'm not finished telling it yet. Hit subscribe, hit the bell, and let me take you back to October. My mother moved into Sycamore Hills 8 months ago following a stroke that left her with weakness on her left side and some difficulty with word retrieval, which is a clinical way of saying that the woman who spent 4 decades finding the exact right word for every child who walked into her library sometimes now has to reach for words that used to come immediately. She finds them, she always finds them. It just takes a breath longer than it used to, and she does not like that, and she tells me so every time we talk, which used to be every evening at 7, and which I am going to tell you about in a moment. The stroke was not catastrophic. I want to be clear about that, because the word stroke carries a weight that sometimes obscures the specific reality. And the specific reality was that my mother walked into the emergency room, was treated, and walked out 3 days later with a referral for rehabilitation and a list of physical therapy exercises she immediately began doing with the same methodical discipline she applied to everything in her life. But she could not go back to her apartment alone. Not yet. Maybe not ever. And we were both learning to hold that maybe without letting it collapse into certainty before we had to. Sycamore Hills was the right choice on paper. I say on paper because I now understand the distance between a facility's paper and its reality in a way I did not understand 8 months ago. And I want you to understand it too before you ever have to learn it the way I did. 4 stars on Medicare's website. Recent inspection report with no major deficiencies noted. A director of nursing who met with me on the phone before admission and answered every question I asked in a way that sounded like knowledge rather than script. Private room, which mattered to my mother, who is not a woman who has ever shared a room with anyone except my father for 31 years before he died. A therapy gym with actual equipment and a dedicated PT on staff 5 days a week. A dining room that had windows. I chose it because I had done the research, because I had read the reports, because I had asked the questions, and because I was 240 miles away, and I needed to believe that the distance was manageable as long as the facility was right. I have thought about that word, manageable, many times since October. Mom settled in well enough the first month. She called me every evening at 7, as she always had, and she told me about the physical therapist, a young woman named Jordan who she liked because Jordan did not talk too much during the exercises, just counted and encouraged at the right moments. She told me about the dining room and the woman at the table next to hers, a retired postal worker named Bet, who had opinions about everything and expressed them without apology, which my mother found refreshing. She told me the bed was too soft. She told me the lighting in her room was inadequate for reading. She told me the coffee was weak. These were the complaints of a woman who was paying attention to her surroundings and had standards, which meant she was okay, which was the thing I needed her to be. I visited in September before the first sign, and again, I noticed nothing wrong. The hallways were clean. The staff who passed us said hello. Mom's room was orderly in the way her rooms were always orderly. Her books arranged on the small shelf by the window, her photographs on the nightstand, the reading lamp I had brought from her apartment, positioned at the angle she needed for the paperback she was currently working through. She walked with me to the garden. Slowly, with the walker, but purposefully. We sat on a bench in the October sun, and she told me about the book club she had started attending on Thursdays, and about the biography of Eleanor Roosevelt she was reading, and about the way the light came through her window in the mornings at an angle that reminded her of the kitchen in the house where I grew up. I drove back to Portland the next morning feeling the particular complicated relief of someone who has made a decision they cannot fully control the outcomes of and who has found, on inspection, that the decision appears to have been sound. I should have stayed longer. I know that now. But I had 32 junior and senior English students waiting for me on Monday morning, and the world does not pause for the decisions you make about your parents. And I drove back over the mountains, and I went back to work, and I called my mother every evening at 7. The calls changed in November, not dramatically, not in any way I could have pointed to with certainty and said there, that is the thing, that is when it shifted. But looking back at those weeks from where I am standing now, I can trace the change the way you can trace the outline of something in the dark once you know what shape you are looking for. She started sounding tired. My mother is not a tired person. She is the woman who at 73 was still leading Saturday morning story hours at the public library as a volunteer because she could not fully leave the work she had loved for 4 decades. She is the woman who reads 2 books simultaneously, one fiction and one nonfiction, because she says they balance each other. She is the woman who during my childhood never napped, considered napping a waste of good waking hours, and would greet my father when he fell asleep in his chair on Sunday afternoons with an affectionate and pointed comment about the proximity of the grave. She started sounding tired in November. The calls were shorter, not dramatically shorter, not in any one call that I could point to, but the average length contracted the way the light contracts in November. Gradually, and without announcements, until one day you realize it has been dark for an hour already, and you do not know exactly when the day ended. She started pausing more. Not the word retrieval pauses from the stroke, which had a specific quality I had learned to recognize and sit with, but different pauses, emptier ones. The pauses of someone who is not searching for a word, but is somewhere else entirely and is taking a moment to return. I started listening harder. I started listening the way you listen when you cannot see the person you are listening to, and you are trying to read the whole of their condition through the narrow channel of their voice. Trying to hear not just the words, but the quality of the air around the words, the specific texture of someone's presence in a phone call that tells you whether they are really there or just performing being there for your benefit. My mother, I should tell you, is not a performer. She has never in my memory performed wellness for my comfort. When she had the flu, she said she had the flu. When my father died and someone asked how she was holding up, she said, honestly, not well. And then she described with precision exactly how she was not well. This is the woman who taught me that the honest answer is always the most useful one. So when I started hearing something in her voice that sounded like performance, something that sounded like a woman saying she was fine from behind a door that was not entirely open, I noticed it. I just did not act on it fast enough. That is the thing I carry. Not in any way I could have pointed to with certainty and said there, that is the thing, that is when it shifted. But looking back at those weeks from where I am standing now, I can trace the change the way you can trace the outline of something in the dark once you know what shape you are looking for. She started sounding tired. My mother is not a tired person. She is the woman who at 73 was still leading Saturday morning story hours at the public library as a volunteer because she could not fully leave the work she had loved for 4 decades. She is the woman who reads 2 books simultaneously, one fiction and one nonfiction, because she says they balance each other. She is the woman who during my childhood never napped, considered napping a waste of good waking hours, and would greet my father when he fell asleep in his chair on Sunday afternoons with an affectionate and pointed comment about the proximity of the grave. She started sounding tired in November. The calls were shorter, not dramatically shorter, not in any one call that I could point to, but the average length contracted the way the light contracts in November. Gradually and without announcement until one day you realize it has been dark for an hour already and you do not know exactly when the day ended. She started pausing more. Not the word retrieval pauses from the stroke, which had a specific quality I had learned to recognize and sit with, but different pauses, emptier ones. The pauses of someone who is not searching for a word but is somewhere else entirely and is taking a moment to return. I told myself it was the adjustment, 8 months is not very long to have been somewhere new, when that somewhere new is also the place where you will spend a significant portion of the rest of your life. I told myself she was tired from the therapy. I told myself winter was always harder, that the reduced light affected everyone, that my mother was 76 and recovering from a stroke and was allowed to be tired. I told myself these things because they were plausible and because the alternative required me to act in ways I did not yet have the information to justify. Then the facility started answering my calls instead of her. The first time was a Tuesday in late November. I called at 7 as always, and instead of my mother's voice on the second ring, I got the front desk and a woman who told me, pleasantly and without particular concern, that Eleanor Voss was resting and could not be disturbed. I said it was her daughter, and called every evening at 7 without exception, and asked that someone let her know I had called. The woman said she would pass that along. My mother did not call back that evening. She called the next morning at 9, which was not our time, and her voice had something underneath it I could not identify, something compressed, like a letter written and then rewritten to remove the parts that would worry the recipient. She said, "I missed your call last night. I was so tired, I'm sorry, baby." I said, "Don't apologize, Mom. I'm just glad you're okay." She said she was fine. She said the therapy had been particularly hard that week. She said she would talk to me more tonight. That night at 7, I called and got the front desk again. "Sleeping," the woman said. "She's been sleeping a lot lately." I said, "My mother does not sleep at 7 in the evening." The woman said that patient sleep patterns often change in care settings, and that it was nothing to be concerned about. I said I would like to speak with the charge nurse. The charge nurse, a man who introduced himself as Paul, told me the same thing with more clinical language. He said my mother had been fatigued following her therapy sessions and that they were monitoring her and that sleep was an important part of the recovery process. He said it with the particular smooth competence of someone who has said this exact thing many times and has learned the precise tone that makes people feel reassured. I was reassured. For 2 more days I was reassured, and then I was not. Because on the 3rd day, they told me she was sleeping again, and I called back 4 hours later, and they told me she was sleeping again, and I called back the next morning, and they told me she was at therapy, and I called at noon, and they told me she was eating, and I called at 2, and they told me she was eating, and I called at 2, and they told me she was resting, and I called at 5, and they told me she was sleeping again, and not one of these people said her name before I did. That is the thing I want you to hold. In 6 calls across 2 days, not one person at Sycamore Hills Care and Rehabilitation said the name Eleanor Voss until I said it first. They picked up the phone and they fielded my questions and they gave me answers, and at no point did they demonstrate any individual knowledge of the specific person I was asking about. She was a room number to them. She was a status on a whiteboard. Sleeping, eating, therapy, resting. She was not Eleanor Voss, who reads 2 books simultaneously and has a reading lamp at a specific angle and told a retired postal worker named Bet that her opinions were refreshing. She was a status. I called my friend Diane that Thursday evening. Diane is 51, a pediatric nurse with 23 years of clinical experience, and the person I call when I need to know whether what I am feeling is intuition or paranoia. I told her about the calls. I told her about the pattern. I told her about my mother's voice changing and the pauses and the tiredness that was not my mother's tiredness. Diane listened to all of it without interrupting, which is her greatest professional skill and also one of the things I love most about her. Then she said 3 words. "Go check yourself." I said, "She's in a 4-star facility." Diane said, "Ratings are staffing ratios on paper." I said, "The inspection report was clean." Diane said, "Inspections are scheduled." I said, "I was just there in September." Diane said, "Cass." She said it the way she says my name when she is done letting me argue. She said, "When was the last time she sounded like herself?" I thought about it. I could not answer. I got in my car the next morning at 5:30. I did not call ahead. I did not tell the facility I was coming. I drove over the mountains in the dark with the radio off, and I thought about my mother and her room with the reading lamp at the specific angle, and I thought about 17 years of second rings, and I told myself I was overreacting, and I did not turn around. I pulled into the Sycamore Hills parking lot at 9:17 on a Friday morning. The building was single-story, buff-colored brick, low and institutional in the way of all buildings built in the 1980s to house the processes of living that the rest of the world prefers not to look at directly. The parking lot had 10 cars in it. The front door was unlocked. I walked in. The lobby was clean and adequately lit and had the particular quality of a space that presents itself rather than exists. The fake flowers and the framed inspirational quote and the whiteboard listing today's activities in careful handwriting. The woman at the front desk looked up and smiled. "Can I help you? I'm here to visit Eleanor Voss in room 14. She looked at her computer. "Are you family?" "I'm her daughter." She printed a visitor badge without asking for ID. She pointed down the hall. "East wing, room 14, second door past the nursing station." I walked down the hall. I have walked down hallways in care facilities before. I know what they are supposed to smell like, which is not very much. Clean surfaces and air circulation, and the particular neutral scent of a well-maintained institution. I know what they are supposed to feel like, which is functional and unhurried. A place where time moves according to the needs of the people living in it rather than the demands of the world outside. The East Wing hallway had 4 overhead lights. 2 of them were out. The floor was clean. The handrails were intact. But there was something about the air that I registered before I had language for it. Something slightly stale, slightly enclosed. The air of a space that is not moved through frequently enough to stay fresh. I passed the nursing station. There was no one at it. A clipboard sat on the counter. A half-empty paper cup of coffee sat next to the clipboard. The coffee had a skin on it. I walked to room 14. I knocked. No answer. I knocked again and said, "Mom, it's Cass. I heard something, not words. A sound. The specific sound of someone trying to make a sound that keeps getting smaller. The sound of someone who has been calling and calling until calling has become something quieter, something more private, something between effort and resignation." I opened the door. The room was dim. The curtains were drawn and the overhead light was off and the reading lamp was not on. My mother was in the bed, not under the covers but on top of them, fully dressed, her left side facing the wall, her right hand resting on her chest. She turned her head when the door opened. Her eyes found me, and something happened in them that I have thought about every day since. Not relief, exactly. Not surprise. Something older than both of those. Something that looked like a person who has been waiting for a long time and has not allowed themselves to stop believing someone would come. She said my name. Not Cass, which is what she usually calls me. Cassandra. My full name. The name she gave me. The name she chose from 4 decades of books and stories and the particular hope that parents carry when they name a child. Cassandra. I crossed the room. I sat on the edge of the bed and I took her hand, and her hand was dry in the way that skin becomes dry when it has not had enough water for too long. Her lips were cracked. Her hair, which she has kept short and neat since before I was born and which has always been combed when I see her, was uncombed. I looked at the nightstand. The water cup was empty. I looked at the call button clipped to the bed rail. I pressed it. I counted. I pressed it again at 30 seconds, again at 60. No one came. I checked the cord the way I had read to do after 3 weeks of reading everything I could find about nursing home neglect between the hours of 11 p.m. and 2 a.m. when I could not sleep. The cord was intact. The connection was in the wall. The button worked. No one was responding to it. I helped my mother sit up. I got her a glass of water from the bathroom tap, and I held it while she drank, and I watched her drink, and I thought about how many times in the last 6 weeks someone should have been doing this and was not. I asked her when she had last eaten. She thought about it. She said, "Breakfast, maybe." It was 9:40 in the morning. I asked her what she had had for breakfast. She said she could not remember. She said they brought a tray. She said she did not always feel hungry, but she tried to eat. I asked her about the calls, why they kept telling me she was sleeping. She looked at me. She said, "They told me you were busy." I said, "What?" She said, "When I asked to call you, they said you were busy." I said, "You were busy." I said, "Mom?" She said, "I didn't want to be a bother." And that sentence is the one I am still carrying. My mother, Eleanor Voss, who spent 42 years making sure every child who walked into her library felt that their story mattered, who organized every book ever written by people who needed to be heard into systems that made sure those books could be found, was lying in a dim room in a facility. 240 miles from her daughter being told that her daughter was busy and was trying not to be a bother. They did not tell me she was sleeping because she was sleeping. They told me she was sleeping because someone in that facility had decided it was easier to tell the family that the resident was resting than to facilitate the connection that the resident was asking for. And my mother, who trusted people who wore uniforms and worked in institutions because that was what her generation had learned to do, had accepted that answer and had tried not to be a bother, and had gotten quieter and smaller and had held her questions inside herself until the questions became something that came out as sound rather than words. The sound I heard through the door. I walked to the nursing station. There was still no one there. I walked back to the front desk. I asked to speak with the director of nursing. The woman at the front desk said she was in a meeting. I said, my mother has been in her room without water and without response to her call button for an indeterminate period, and I need to speak with someone in charge immediately. She picked up the phone. The director of nursing, a woman in her late 40s, named Sandra Hollis, came out of her meeting. I want to tell you about that conversation. I want to tell you about it carefully because I think it is the most important part of the story in a way that is different from the dramatic parts, different from the camera and the arrests and the 3 in the morning footage that the Tory nun story contained and that this story does not have. This story has a conversation, and the conversation matters as much as anything else because this is what happens most of the time, not with cameras and attorneys and criminal charges, but with 2 people in a hallway and a family member who has driven 240 miles on a Friday morning because her mother's voice changed in November and she did not know why. Sandra Hollis sat down with me in the family consultation room and she listened. She listened with the particular quality of listening that is actually assessment, the listening of an administrator who is taking the measure of a situation and deciding how serious it is and what her exposure looks like. I told her what I had found. The empty water cup, the unanswered call button, the uncombed hair, my mother's statement that she had been told I was busy when she asked to call me, my mother's statement that this had happened multiple times, the 6 days of being told she was sleeping. Sandra Hollis took notes. She said she took these concerns very seriously. She said she would look into it. She said she apologized for my experience. And I looked at her across that table, and I thought about what Diane had said. Ratings are staffing ratios on paper, inspections are scheduled, and I thought about my mother in that room saying she did not want to be a bother. And I said, Sandra, I need you to understand something. She waited. I said, I am not here for an apology and I am not here for an assurance that this will be looked into. I said, I am here because my mother has a stroke history, is on blood pressure medication, and has been inadequately hydrated for an indeterminate number of days, and I need you to tell me right now what your staffing ratio has been on the East Wing overnight for the past 30 days. She paused. I said, I know what the state minimum is. I said, I know what your Medicare filings show. I said, I need you to tell me what your actual clock and records show. She said she would need to pull those records. I said, I'll wait. I sat in that family consultation room for 40 minutes. I sat there because leaving would have meant accepting a later answer, and a later answer meant more time before the situation changed, and my mother had already had enough later. Sandra Hollis came back with a printed sheet. She placed it on the table between us. I read it. The East Wing, 12 rooms, had been staffed by a single overnight aide on 19 of the past 30 nights. Not 2 aides, not the 3. Their Medicare filing showed 1. 19 nights, 1 aide, 12 rooms, 12 elderly residents with stroke histories and cardiac conditions and mobility limitations and the specific vulnerabilities of people who have been placed in care facilities because they cannot safely manage those vulnerabilities alone. 1 person, to answer their calls, manage their medications, respond to their falls, change their positions, bring them water, and tell their daughters whether they were sleeping. I looked at Sandra Hollis. She looked at the table. I said, this is the information I am taking with me today, along with the record of this conversation, the dates of my calls, and the information my mother provided about being told I was too busy when she asked to phone me. I said, I am giving you 1 week to show me documented corrective action on staffing and the written explanation of the communication practices that led to my mother being told her daughter was unavailable. I said, if I do not receive that documentation within 7 days, I am filing a formal complaint with the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare and I am contacting the Long-Term Care Ombudsman's office. She said she understood. I said, and I am moving my mother's care if what I see in the next 30 days does not match what I need to see. She said she understood. I drove home that afternoon, having done everything I had come to do. Having found what I was afraid to find, having named it in a room with the person responsible for it, having left my mother with a full water cup and a call button that I had personally verified was being answered before I walked out of the building. 3 days after I left, my phone rang at 7 in the evening. Second ring, Mom. Her voice was different. Not fully back, not the voice I had been hearing at 7 o'clock for 17 years without interruption, but more like it, more present. She said, I told that woman today that I would like to call my daughter every evening at 7, and I would like her to help me do that if I need help, and she said yes. I said, which woman? She said, the new one on the evening shift. She said her name was Keisha, and she was young, and she had a laugh that could fill a room. She said Keisha had brought her an extra pillow without being asked because she had noticed my mother repositioning herself. She said Keisha had refilled her water cup at shift change and had left a second cup on the nightstand in case she was thirsty overnight. She said Keisha had told her that calling her daughter every evening at 7 was not a bother. She said Keisha had told her it was the kind of thing she was there for. I held the phone and I listened to my mother talk about Keisha, and I thought about what it takes to be the person who says it is the kind of thing I am here for, to a 76-year-old woman in a dim room who has spent weeks trying not to be a bother. It does not take extraordinary training. It does not take a special credential or a particular certification. It takes the decision, made fresh at the start of every shift, to see the people in the rooms not as a checklist, but as people. Keisha made that decision. Every aide who told my mother her daughter was busy made the other one. I held the phone and I listened to my mother talk about Keisha. And I cried, not quietly, not the managed kind, the other kind, the kind that comes when you have been holding something tightly for so long that the moment it loosens even slightly, the whole compressed weight of the holding releases at once. And I would like her to help me do that if I need help. And she said yes. I said, which woman? She said, the new one on the evening shift. She said her name was Keisha, and she was young, and she had a laugh that could fill a room. She said Keisha had brought her an extra pillow without being asked, because she had noticed my mother repositioning herself. She said Keisha had refilled her water cup at shift change and had left a second cup on the nightstand in case she was thirsty overnight. She said Keisha had told her that calling her daughter every evening at 7 was not a bother. She said Keisha had told her it was the kind of thing she was there for. I held the phone and I listened to my mother talk about Keisha, and I cried. Not quietly, not the managed kind, the other kind, the kind that comes when you have been holding something tightly for so long that the moment it loosens even slightly, the whole compressed weight of the holding releases at once. I want to tell you what happened with the facility, because it is not the story of arrests and handcuffs that the reference script contains, and I think it is important that I tell you the version that happened rather than the version that is more dramatic. Sandra Hollis sent me documentation within the 7 days, a revised staffing schedule showing 2 aides on the East Wing every overnight going forward, a written acknowledgement that communication practices regarding family contact had been inadequate, and that staff had been given specific instruction that family members requesting contact with a resident were to be connected or the resident was to be assisted in initiating contact. A record of a staff meeting in which these expectations had been communicated. It was not everything I needed it to be. It was not an admission of what had happened, or an apology to my mother, or an accounting for the 19 nights of insufficient staffing. But it was change that was documented, and it was change I could verify on subsequent visits, and it was change that meant a phone call home at 7 in the evening was no longer a request that got filed under sleeping. I filed a complaint with the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare anyway, not out of retaliation, out of the knowledge that Sycamore Hills had 12 other families who did not know about the 19 nights and who deserved to have a record that existed independently of the facility's internal corrective action. The state conducted a review. They found staffing documentation irregularities. They issued a citation. The facility was required to submit a plan of correction. All of this is in the public record now. All of this is available to the next family who looks up Sycamore Hills Care and Rehabilitation on the state website before they move their mother in. I want to tell you the thing that has stayed with me most from that Friday morning. Not the empty water cup. Not the unanswered call button. Not Sandra Hollis's face when she placed the staffing sheet on the table between us. The thing that has stayed with me most is what my mother said when I sat on the edge of her bed and took her hand and asked her why she had not tried harder to reach me. She said, "I didn't want to make trouble." She said it quietly and without self-pity and with the particular resignation of a person who has learned over decades to calibrate her needs against the patience of the people around her. My mother, who made sure every child who walked into her library felt seen and welcome and deserving of the story they were looking for, had decided somewhere in the dim room on the east wing that she was not worth the trouble of connecting with her daughter. That is not the result of one bad nurse or one thoughtless aide or one night of inadequate staffing. That is what happens when a person is placed in a system that is too understaffed to see her and too underprepared to tell the truth, and too accustomed to the families who don't drive over the mountains, and so has stopped anticipating the ones who will. That is what happens when a person trusts that the people wearing the uniforms are the right people to trust. My mother is not wrong to trust. I do not want her to become a person who does not trust. I want her to be in a place that is worthy of it. She is still at Sycamore Hills, not because I stopped looking, because the change held, at least enough, at least for now, and because moving her again would cost her something in continuity and comfort, and the specific anchoring of Bet from the dining room and the book club on Thursdays and Keisha's laugh that can fill a room. I visit every 3 weeks now, not every month, every 3 weeks. I drive over the mountains on a Friday morning and I sit with her and I walk with her in the garden and I eat lunch with her in the dining room and I know the name of her physical therapist and the name of the evening aide and the name of the charge nurse and the name of the administrator. I know the shift schedule. I know the staffing ratios from the most recent filing and I know how to check whether they match the clock and records. I press the call button every time I visit and I time the response and I write it down. Not because I am waiting to use it against anyone, because the writing of it is a signal, visible to the staff, that someone is paying attention, that someone will notice if the number changes, that Eleanor Voss in room 14 has a daughter who drives over the mountains and who will keep driving over the mountains for as long as she needs to. My mother calls me every evening at 7, second ring, every time. Sometimes the word retrieval takes a breath, and I wait for it without filling the silence because the silence belongs to her, and she will find what she is looking for, she always does. And I am not going to take that from her by rushing to help. She told me last week about a new book she has started, a novel about a librarian. She said, "Tetrally." I said, "Obviously." She laughed, her full laugh. The one I have known my whole life. The one that was there the first time I called her on my own phone at 17 and she picked up on the second ring and said, "Cassandra, I was just thinking about you." That laugh. It came through the phone at 7 in the evening and I was in my kitchen in Portland and the mountains were between us and she was 240 miles away and she was fine. She was fine and I knew it because I had made it my business to know it, because I had not accepted sleeping as an answer. When sleeping did not sound like my mother, because I had driven over the mountains in the dark, because I had sat in a consultation room and waited 40 minutes for a staffing sheet, because I had made trouble. My mother said she did not want to make trouble. I want to tell you, in case no one has told you recently, that making trouble for the people who are supposed to care for your people is not a character flaw. It is a form of love. It is the specific form of love that shows up unannounced on a Friday morning and presses the call button and counts to 60 and does not leave until the water cup is full. It is not a comfortable form of love. It will make some people in some facilities look at you the way Sandra Hollis looked at me across that table. Good. Let them look. The alternative is a phone that rings at 7 and a woman at the front desk who says she's sleeping. And if you have ever heard that and something in your body said that is not the answer and you ignored that thing, I want you to hear something. That thing was right. That thing is always right. Listen to it. Pick up your keys. Drive over whatever mounts are between you and the person who used to pick up on the second ring. I did. And on a Friday morning at 9:40 in a dim room on the East Wing, My mother said my full name the way she said it when I was born, and she had just chosen it, and I walked in from the hallway and I sat down next to her and I held her dry hand. She was there. She had been there the whole time. She just needed someone to come find her. I will keep coming to find her. Every 3 weeks. Over the mountains. In the dark if I have to. That is the only promise that matters. If your parent has stopped sounding like themselves, if the facility keeps telling you they are resting, if the calls have gotten shorter and the pauses have gotten longer and something in your chest says this is not right, trust that. Pick up your keys. You do not need a camera. You do not need an attorney. You do not need clinical training or legal knowledge or anything other than the willingness to show up unannounced and press the call button and wait for someone to come. And if no one comes, you be the one who comes. Thank you for being here until the end. If this reached something real in you, leave it in the comments. Tell me about the call that changed. Tell me what you did when you heard the silence. I read every single one. And if you know someone whose parent is somewhere they cannot watch every day, send them this. It might be the reason they drive over the mountains. I will see you next time.